Welcome to another video brought to you by Cascadia DataWorks. Um, I like to go out to the Jet message boards and always look for questions and find people that are out there asking great questions. And I thought David here asked a really great question, one that is really common for report building. And maybe it doesn't exactly apply to you, but the idea might trigger and say, oh, yeah, I need something similar to that. So he's saying he's trying to sort customer balance by the last transaction date, that last posting date. And he knows how to do the sort in the customer table based on the number or balances, but he just doesn't know how to use that last transaction date because it's in the customer ledger entry table. Really, the only way to know the last transaction date is to look at all of their transactions and go, okay, yeah, here's the most recent date that I see. So he says, I don't know how to integrate the customer ledger sort into sorting of the customer table. So, David, great question. And so I've kind of built my own example off of this. What we're going to do is we're going to pull back our customer numbers and their name and their balance. We're going to determine their last transaction date. We're going to look at their credit limit and we're going to then calculate what their available credit is, right? Their credit limit minus their balance should show me their available credit. And if it's getting too small or too close to being, over the limit, we're going to reach out to whoever we pull back from the contact and the phone from that customer table. Okay. So the very first thing we need to do is actually pull back the list of customer numbers. We are going to start with our rows, right? Because we want a list of things. And I think probably one of the challenges that David is having, along with many others, is by default they're going out to the customer table, right? Well, sorting has to be done on the filters, and as he pointed out, there's a last date modified, but that's really when we change like a phone number or a contact or an address. So there's nothing in here that actually shows the date, and that's where we're running into the problem. But as he noted, it's in the customer ledger entry table. So really what I want to do is I want to go out to the customer ledger entry table and I want to bring back a list of customer numbers. But when we do our sort, we have to do it on a filter. And what is our criteria? What are we looking for? Based on that posting date. Now, with Jet, we have to put in a value here, and maybe you want to cut it off, right? If the most recent date up until the end of last month or whatever it is. But most of the time, when we're talking about sorting, people use the wildcard. The posting date could be anything. It doesn't really matter what it is. So it's not including well, it's including everything and not excluding anything. It's really, hey, everything. But this allows us to apply a sort. Now, if I hit this little arrow once, it will add the plus, and that says an ascending order. So what's ascending order for dates? Well, that's the oldest date to the newest date. He wants the most recent transaction, or based on the last transaction. Now, I don't know, he didn't specify that he wanted it sorted in one specific way. He just said he wanted it based on the last transaction date. But I'm going to assume the most recent transaction we're going to put on there, and we're going to make that minus, right? We're going to reverse the sort of the list and say, okay, when the newest date is at the top and the oldest date is at the bottom. So depending on what you need, you can just switch that to your own personal need, and you'll notice you click it a third time, that sort goes away altogether. So I'm going to put that in there. Now, when you run this report, or when you see your preview here, never trust this number. This number may or may not be right. Now, this is true of all JET reports. This is just showing you a preview. Yeah, I found something. I was able to connect to that table and I found a value. This may or may not be right. Never trust your reports until you run it, especially with sorts. Sorts can be really funky in that it will not actually apply the sort until you run the report. So that 526 may or may not be right. In this case, it happened to be right, but it's not necessarily always going to be that way. So always double check, run your report. It's a really good habit to get into. Just in general, as you're building reports, build out a little bit, test it, go back to design, test it, do those types of things. You don't want to get to the very end and then test it and realize you've had an error here and everything else gets affected by it. So I'm a big proponent of testing those things along the way. So great, we've got the customer number here. Well, we know we need to pull the customer number, the balance, the credit limit, the contact, and the phone number from the customer table. Well, what I would have to do with that is I would have to come in and say, okay, well, give me the first I need to go out to that customer table and bring me back the name, right? Firsts are great for those questions that have one answer. And I'm going to filter on the number here. Always remember to filter back on something. You'll notice I copied or I locked down the column. And this is just so I don't have to keep typing this over and over again, right? Because balance is really give me the first balance. Oops, I have to go to customer table with the balance. And what do I need to filter on? I need to filter on the number, and the number is right over here. So I can continue to do this over and over and over again for each one of those, or I can simply copy and paste and paste and paste and just change the function. So in the credit limit, I don't necessarily remember what credit limit is, so I might come back in, modify that, open that credit amount. I wanted credit limit. Okay. Contact, well, I know contact is contact. That one's pretty easy. Contact. And phone number, I think, is phone NO. So you can see you can actually just modify this right up here. I don't even need to open the JFX, the Jet Function Wizard. I'm going to run this, and away we go. Okay, so we're looking good. We've got all that information. We just need this available credit, which is, well, what's your credit limit? Subtracted out your balance, and we can see we actually don't extend anybody credit limit, so everybody is over the top here. Now, I know what you're saying, Brian. How do we know this is actually sorted in last transaction date? Well, I've built a proof in here, but we haven't done anything. Right now, you just have to trust that it works. So anytime I'm building in a replicator with some sort of sort like this, I always like to build in a proof field to just prove that, yes, what I'm doing is correct. Okay, so I'm going to open up the NL, and what do I need to do? Well, I need to pull the most recent one singular date. And so I need to go to that customer ledger entry table. And what do I want to pull back? The posting date. Okay. Now, I want to pull back the posting date associated with that customer, so I'm going to add that filter on there. Always good on each line, lock that down. Now, the last thing I need to do here is one more thing. A lot of times this is where customers, clients that I work with, just leave it off and then they run this report. You'll notice that it says the last transaction date is 2017. You'll notice that this will change, possibly, maybe not. But I look at this and I go, huh, well, this doesn't seem right. These are pretty old. I've definitely sold to these people in the last 8 to 10, 12 years. So something's wrong here. Well, what did I tell it to do? I said, hey, go out to the customer ledger entry table and bring me back the first posting date you find. That's probably going to be a really, really old record. So what I need to do is I need to add a sort to it and say, hey, as you're looking through all of the dates, make sure when you build your list to look through that you sort these. So in this case, I want to pull the most recent. And so what this really is doing behind the scenes, it says, hey, let me go out to the customer ledger entry table. I will get a list of posting dates associated with that customer, and I will grab the first one that I find on that list. But this sort then allows us to change the order of that list and say, okay, instead of just whatever the database has as its sort, resort that list in posting date descending order, and I hit OK. And again, and you might go, wow, that didn't change anything. Well, again, don't trust it until you run your report. This time we should see that change, and in fact we do see it, and I do see that this is in descending order. So if I wanted it the other way, if I wanted it in ascending order, I could simply come in here and I could change this to positive. Okay. And I run this report and we will see a very similar idea. The order is definitely different, and we can see our dates here. So if we want to find, like, hey, here's our oldest and truest customer. It was our very first one, Gamma Rays, because they, their very first transaction was on the 1st of 2016. So, depending on how you want to look at that is how you want to do it. I'm going to keep it in the most recent. I think that is probably what David was asking for, so I'm going to fix those two things in there. So I mentioned that this is great. This gets us exactly what we need, but I want to talk a little bit about report efficiency and why building reports efficiently is really important. So as we noticed, let's go ahead and highlight this, 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 and this are all NL firsts to the customer table, pulling back a specific field based on that customer number. So what happens when you run the report? Well, I have my customer table here, so let's go ahead and run this. What is actually happening behind the scenes is it gets to this NL first. It says, okay, I'm going to go out to the customer table. I'm going to look at that number field, okay, wherever it might be. There we go. I'm going to look through that number field until it finds 528, 526. Then it's going to pull back the name. Then it gets to the balance. It says, oh, I need to go back out to the customer table. So it goes back out to the customer table, researches that number field till it finds 526, and pulls back the balance. Credit limit does the same thing. Contact. So every single time this has to go out for each one of those fields in each of these columns to research the customer table for that customer number and then pull back the value. That's very, very, very inefficient because it's searching this 526 table 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times when we really don't need to, because we know these all come from the same kind of record in the database. If I could just tell it where that record is, that would solve a lot of my problems. So this is a way around that. Typically, if I see, I'd say probably 3 or more fields, NL first, NL first, NL first, all coming from the same table in a report like this, this is the technique I use. So you'll notice I have a lot of the same information here, but I'm going to insert a column here, and I'm going to call this my customer key. Customer key. Okay. And I'm going to do an NL first, but I'm going to go to the customer table, right? Because that's where all this information is coming from. But I'm going to leave that field blank, and I'm going to say, hey, when the number is this, lock down my column. So by leaving that field blank, I'm saying I don't want to pull back a certain piece of information. I want to pull back the entire record, or essentially the record address. And that's what it's doing. It's saying, hey, go out to this database demo, go out to this company, JetCorp USA, go to table 18, and in field number 1, here is that primary key. And we can see it's still 526. It matches 526, 526. Right? So the primary key in the customer table is the customer number. It's a unique identifier. Why would I care about doing this? Right? This is gibberish. This is nonsense. But this allows me to use my NF function that simply says, hey, where is the address of that? And what field do I want to bring back? Name. Now I've got the NF. I can copy, paste everywhere where I was doing the previous ones, and I just modify this way. This report will be far more efficient built this way than the other way, because it doesn't have to research the customer table every time. It knows which record it specifically is trying to pull back. And in reality, what it's actually doing is when it goes out to the database, it's pulling back and saying, okay, this record, and these are the fields that I need from that record. So it's kind of doing one pull instead of 5 or 6 pulls. It's really just doing one. So you can see how that would add up in our report. If I were to run this report, let's see how many we have here. So if I have in this report, I can't see because of my little editing software, 134 customers, and then I do first, what do I get? I get 134 times five, is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 670 queries. Well, over here, realistically, I have just this one query, and then I'm pulling back that information. So 134 versus the greater number, the 600, you could see how that might add up in a bigger report with more customers and more columns that we need to pull back. Okay? The last transaction date would work exactly the same, so I can actually just copy that from here. We can put in our available credit, equals this minus that. We can do our formatting like we always like to do. And now the only thing I might do is hide this customer key because nobody needs to see that in the report. But now when I run this report, as your report gets bigger and bigger, you'll notice that the time difference between these two can jump up exponentially. Or this one might take 10 or 15 seconds. This one might take 45 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. I have definitely seen that where a lot of NL firsts will add a lot of time to a report. In fact, there was one instance where a client of mine had so many customers that they had 5 NL firsts, and that took anywhere from 10 to 12 minutes. We converted that to a similar fashion like this, and I think it came down in under a minute. So we were looking at 10 to 12 minutes or under a minute runtime between the two. So big difference, and especially if you're going against a cloud source, efficiency is king, and we want to make sure we're getting the right information, obviously, but the most efficient information as well.